Buenos días.
Good morning to you all. We're going to start the closing ceremony. After these 3 hard working days, I'd like to thank very much and greet especially the authorities that are here with us today. Here to my left, Mr. Juan Ramón Lacadena Calero, because he is going to be awarded with the SIBI prize. Mr. Palacios will summarize his profile, but before that I wanted to briefly summarize what we have addressed in the last 3 days. Very intensive days. We have talked not about what we can do, but what we should do. Let's not forget that bioethics focuses on duty, should. What is good, what is bad in genome editing, and what we should not do as well. It is good to cure a person. Some question has come up whether we should cure an embryo or enhance a person. We have wondered where the boundary is. Many times terms came up such as accessibility, profitability, equity, fairness, justice. It is fundamental to pose the right questions. Who is benefiting from what? Who invests on what and why? What to improve and why? What is the regulatory framework? If it is time to design a universal governance, maybe firstly we have to reach a consensus on that. One of the risks is that those who most could benefit from it maybe do not have access or cannot afford it. Francis Crick already said it in 2023, and other people have repeated this message as well. We were warned as well about the hereditary genome editing not to be performed unless it is safe and under social consensus. The question that came up in all panels is what for, what kind of world we want to live in. And for that, we need to establish a dialogue with the citizens, an inclusive dialogue, not only with training, but also with commitment and engagement to understand these complex topics. And I repeat the message given by our students: future is in our hands. That is, we close the Congress, but we have to continue making headway in the different levels, in reflection, constructive dialogue, laying bridges, because the most powerful weapon we have is word. And with our word, we have to get engaged to build a better world for everybody. Again, thank you very much. to Professor Marcelo Palacios, to all the members of the Scientific Committee of the SIBI, the sponsors, the trustees, all those who have participated actively in the conference through talks, conference videos, questions, comments, etc. The interpreters, thank you very much for your work. Interpreters appreciate it. And the people who have organized and helped organize the Congress, the sign language interpreters, hostesses, the staff of the venue, Chamber of Commerce, and I hope I am not forgetting anyone, and of course the Secretary, Beatriz García. Thank you very much to you all. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to Mr. Marcelo Palacios, who will summarize Juan Ramón Lacadena Calero's profile. We will give him the SIBI Prize Award 2024. So without further ado, the Scientific Committee of SIBI agreed to give the award to Mr. Juan Ramón Lacadena Calero. He's an expert in bioethics and genetics. He's here with us, here at the panel.
Professor Lacadena.
Professor Lacadena is very well known in the world of genetics, not only in Spain, but also in Europe and worldwide. In my house, I have his book on genetics. That is a thick, very thick book. A book that any chair from Germany could have written, and then another small book that is a summary on the same topic. Those of us who were only beginners in that topic, we could go to the teachings of the big and the little books. But apart from that, he contributes with humanity, closeness, and during all his life devoted to genetics and bioethics, he has disseminated knowledge all around the world regarding the appropriate and rational use of scientific knowledge. He is here today with us because he's going to be awarded with this prize, because he deserves it. The Scientific Committee never doubted it, for his contribution to the world of bioethics. So welcome, Professor Lacadena. Thank you so much. It is an honor to have received counseling and teachings from you, and I hope that in the future I will continue receiving those teachings from you. Thank you so much.
Presidenta del Comité Científico.
President of the Scientific Committee of the SIBI, honorific President of the SIBI, authorities of the Principality of Asturias, ladies and gentlemen, and students, some of them present here today. Dear Isolina, Marcelo, thank you so much to you and all the members of the scientific committee for awarding me with this prize that I receive very thrilled, because it comes from an institution with an acknowledgement worldwide, and the statements or outcomes of the congresses are quoted worldwide. For many years I have participated actively in the different editions of this conference. For my wife and myself, they have been a reason to spend some time in GIJON, and we have enriched ourselves with the talks by experts, and we have enjoyed the welcoming climate of Mr. Marcelo Palacios and his wife, and also Dr. Isolina. During those days we had a really good time and a time for reflection. I'd like to highlight the important topics chosen for the debates throughout the years, always thinking about universal commitment with mankind, universal rights of everybody with regard to applications of biology and medicine. We have also talked about violence against women, environment and sustainable development, or hunger and poverty. They were some of the topics of some editions. On the one hand, because these topics have always been a reason to get in depth about these topics from a legal, financial, or any other standpoint. Very plural topics, and also because they are a call to commitment and sensitivity. I'd like to underscore the concern of the SIBI to stimulate the interest on bioethics among the youth. I was very happy to see that this year as well, students have been invited to present their works and to participate in a debate. The future of bioethics, our future is their future. In life you have to make a decision. Sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong, because you make the wrong decision. In my academic life in 1997, I made the decision to devote most of my time to bioethic reflection, and today when receiving this prize, I see that it was a right decision. And I will finish. At my age, you think a lot about the past. And my past is linked to thankfulness. Thank you, Marcelo, because since the 90s you invited me to the courses held at the University of Cádiz, San Roque, and thank you, Isolina, for the love you have always shown us. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention and your attendance. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Quisiera que...
Thank you so much. So this applause is also for his beloved wife, Miss Isabel, who is here with us today, and she was also a great support in for his achievements. Thank you, Isabel. Now, the floor is for Fernando Zombrona Fragas, President of the Asturian Pharmaceutical Cooperative, COFAS. Thank you, Isolina. Authorities, good morning to you all. On behalf of COFAS, it is a great honor and privilege to be here in the official closing of the 12th World Conference on Bioethics. For many years we have sponsored this important event, and every year we feel more and more committed with their purpose and mission. This Congress is a unique opportunity to gather experts worldwide and debate the most thrilling and innovative challenges in the field of bioethics. We talk about ethical issues regarding pharmaceutics and also the practice. This has always been like a lighthouse to feed our reflections. As a pharmaceutical cooperative and as a pharmaceutical experts, we understand the crucial importance of integrating ethical considerations in all our activities, from the delivery of drugs to the solidarity distribution and also counseling and support to our clients. We make an effort to guarantee that every step we give is in the line with the highest ethical and moral standards. Our collaboration with this conference is also an illustration of this commitment. When sponsoring this event, we are not only supporting research and debating bioethics, we are also reassuring our engagement and commitment with bioethics in the promotion of health worldwide. I'd like to thank the SIBI for organizing this Congress once again, and for giving us the opportunity to be part of this important movement. Also, thank you very much to all the speakers, attendees, and collaborators who have enriched our discussions with their approaches and knowledge. In conclusion, once again, highlight our commitment, a commitment of COFAS to continue collaborating with SIBI and other bodies to promote bioethics in ethics worldwide. Let's continue working together to build a world in which human dignity and ethical principles are our guide. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. And those of you who are not from GIJON, I hope you have enjoyed your stay here in GIJON and have a safe trip back home. Thank you.
A continuación tiene...
Now the floor is for Mr. Jorge González-Palacios of Ortea, who is Councillor for Institutional Relations of City Council of GIJON. Thank you very much, Jorge, because from the very first time you have supported the organization of this Congress in big and small things altogether. Dear colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, authorities, firstly, I apologize because our mayor, Carmen Morillo, could not make it because she had a very tight agenda, and she apologizes. But she has insisted on me greeting you on her behalf. Thank you very much for inviting us to be here to officially close the 12th World Conference on Bioethics held in GIJON. As you know, this is the world venue on bioethics. I want to congratulate Isolina and Marcelo for the success of this new edition 2024, and also the award winner, Mr. Juan Ramón Lacadena. Also, I would like to highlight the high level of speakers. Thank you very much to all the speakers who have contributed to the success of this Congress, because the speakers and attendees are the main piece of the puzzle of this conference. Also, thank you so much to those who came from far away. I know that also some people had to take international flights, long flights, so the City Council of GIJON wants to thank you for being here. And the City Council of GIJON is very happy to participate and do as much as we can for the SIBI to continue celebrating and organizing this conference. The City Council is here to help you. And just highlight once again our commitment and engagement to continue collaborating in future editions. I join what my colleagues said. I hope that you have enjoyed the city, safe trip back home, and also give you a piece of advice or a favor. Come back very soon because we will be waiting for you with open arms. Thank you very much.
A continuación.
Now, Mr. Pablo García, Vice Regional Minister for Health Policy, on behalf of the Regional Minister for Health of the Principality of Asturias, Ms. Concepción Saavedra. She could not make it. She had a health issue, so she could not make it. And I thank very much Mr. Pablo García for the support of the Regional Ministry for Health of the Principality of Asturias. Thank you.
Thank you, Isolina. Dear member of the City Council and members of the organization of this 12th conference, members of the Scientific Conference of the SIBI, Juan, Ramón, dear speakers, attendants, attendees of the conference, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to be representing the government of the Principado de Asturias, the Asturias region, in this conference, this international conference that places Asturias in the map, and especially GIJON in the map in these prestigious topics. And I want to start my intervention by congratulating, as you said, Isolina, congratulating you on behalf of Concepción Saavedra, the Regional Minister for Health. We want to congratulate you, the Scientific Committee, and the President of the SIBI, who took over from the founder of the association, Marcelo, the Honorary President of the Scientific Committee, for choosing this topic and for organizing this state-of-the-art scientific agenda. Almost 25 years ago, in the first Conference on Bioethics and Human Genome and the Ethical Considerations, were a hot topic back then. So it was quite a breakthrough back then, and since this has been a recurring issue in several conferences, we must recognize that SIBI was able to see the extent of the scientific innovations that paved the way for future techniques. So you were kind of visionaries and pioneers. Because a few years later, a few decades later, you are discussing the bioethical and legal aspects of genetic editing. So as we said, this is a very specific topic, not well known by citizenship at large. But it is anyway very interesting, and it has many potentials, because it is of the utmost importance to see many experts from all over the world to talk about these issues that will be beneficial for the whole of humanity, whole of humankind. And I want to recognize you, the speakers, people who spend part of your working time, part of your career to studying these type of things that are sometimes risky, challenging, where no shortcuts are easy, that will contribute to creating hope and health to the people who need this kind of breakthrough. So I want to congratulate you, the speakers, and the students of the schools of GIJON and the outskirts and the rest of Asturias about the use of this technology. I don't want to use any more of your time, because you've been discussing this for already 3 days. I just want to say that gene editing is not science fiction, because not anymore, because some drugs have been approved to treat treat, to cure some of these diseases, and probably many more in the future. So I am representing the government of Asturias, the public administration here, and of course our purpose is to make it possible so that for those drugs to reach their patients, their intended patients. And we care about safety, of course. Safety is one of the priorities of the political agenda of the health ministry, and I hope that these techniques will enable us to treat formerly incurable diseases or to prevent other diseases from happening. The Asturian society is really engaged and committed to making this possible. For example, we are working also on the creation of a pool of researchers for the prevention of hereditary diseases and cancer processes. We have extraordinary experts and specialists, and we can be proud of what we are achieving in this region. But this progress cannot be just for a few. They need to reach all of the citizens. Just because they can only be ethically fair and just if they are universal. Gene addition, gene editing, and advanced therapies that are making this breakthrough cannot be just in the hands of an elite or in the hands of the privileged few in a few countries that can pay them with their abundant resources. Technological challenge must be, or technological advances must be framed or must be used in a public arena and protected by the public administration. Without public health system that caters for most of the patients and their families, research will probably be slower and will probably or will surely be more unequal. Another aspect is that public health systems must look for mechanisms to get access to those innovative treatments that are so pricey without compromising the rest of the system. That's why collaboration between institutions, researchers, and pharmaceutical companies is of the utmost importance if we are to treat patients in the most equitable way. There is an ethical aspect behind that, and we must all commit to it. We must not lose sight of the citizenship and the territories. Pandemic made it clear to all of us that we share one planet, and many, all these billion people, all these billions of people have a say in this. And finally, how to give an ethical answer to these research issues. All of these pricey treatments, all of these diseases, all of these techniques need to be compatible with something else, something that is really important for all of us. I'm referring to the primary healthcare systems, the primary doctors. In Spain, we have more than 300 primary healthcare facilities that are essential for most of the people, where the family doctors take care of everyone throughout their lives, and also their children, and well, the whole family. And we want to show our commitment to the preservation of these family doctors and the primary healthcare system, well spread in the territory, sustainable and durable. So this all needs to go, therefore, to the basic layers of the healthcare system, the family doctors and the primary healthcare system. Juan Ramón Lacadena, Professor of Genetics, is the new laureate of the SIBI award. I want to congratulate you personally on this award. And I would simply conclude by saying that I want to thank you again for organizing such a quality conference, again, that places Asturias and GIJON at the core of these issues. Thank you. And now, finally, we have Dr. Marcelo Palacios Alonso, President, Honorary President of the Scientific Committee of the SIBI and founder of the SIBI.
Hace 24 años me subí a este atril para inaugurar el primer Congreso Mundial.
Well, 24 years ago was the first conference on bioethics, but SIBI was born 2 years earlier, in December 1997. We wanted to be the gardener or the keeper of one of the documents of the history of humankind, the fifth most important document, someone said, the convention, the bioethics convention, the Oviedo Convention, that was signed in Asturias on April the 4th, 1997. The day before, the main representatives met in GIJON. Dr. Lenny Fischer, one of the leaders of the Council of Europe, Daniel Tarsis, Norwegian liberal politician. Lenny Fischer was a social democrat German politician. I consider them to be friends. She was the president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and he was the Secretary General. And they thought that the convention should be opened for signing in Asturias. And I am really happy when I remember this kind of facts, because I had left the Council of Europe 4 months ago, and they still thought it was a good idea to start that signing process in Oviedo. Well, so as I was saying, we met for the first time for this occasion in GIJON and then in Oviedo. It was in Teatro Jovellanos. If you read the Martin Fierro's poem, quietly, but doing things all the time, like the flowers and the field that end up being beautiful inadvertently, without any noise, quietly. So we've been growing quietly, we've been growing and growing. We didn't want to cause any envy, we just want to be left alone and do what we wanted to. But we had this list of things that made it possible. First, because we had a scientific committee of people from 18 countries that used their knowledge and their strength and their boost, their specialized knowledge in all domains, legal, medical, etc., that gave this conference a boost, an incredible boost. I've been thrilled to receive a message from one of the most relevant scientific committees, this one, and of course, okay, you need an idea, but you need the engine or the strength or the driver. The driver were our financial sponsors, those who believed in this scientific committee. Some of them were, for example, Mayor Areces. Mayor Areces back then allowed me to use one of the telephones of the city council, of the town hall, to call some of them in the US and other countries because I didn't have the means. Well, that was an essential booster. I was referring to the financial sponsors, but of course we cannot forget the support of the city council that also, for example, gave us a building, the gota de leche, the drop of milk, or the fourth one, I think, I'm sorry, because there are one in France, one in Barcelona, or two in Barcelona maybe, and then one in GIJON. It's a beautiful building. It is appreciated by all visitors, and it's really worth a visit. But we must recognize other types of supporters. COFAS, for example, has been there since day one. Also the Ramón Areces Foundation, who has no special interest in other types of associations. They supported us with money and also with the material that we need for this type of conferences, in exhibitions, etc. And then, of course, the third pillar, the third support, is the pedagogical program, the student program. You've seen it today. A few years ago, there was someone in the public, in the audience, who said that he was Secretary of State for Education of another region, and he was totally taken aback by the quality and the eloquence of the students that participated in that edition. So they are another driver too, of course. They don't have any, they don't need to be here, but they come here, they enroll in this pedagogical program. I remember, for example, one of the Nobel Prize laureates said to me, "I've never seen such a thing in France." So that's one of the reasons why I am thrilled and honored and touched. SIBI would not be what it is without all of us. The pedagogical program is per se the main pillar, one that would justify the mere existence of SIBI. So we are now in a new era. Bioethics understands the tenets of science and biology from a harmonic point of view between all human beings. That is our philosophy. It was said that science and technology are not temples or tombs. We do temples or tombs, sorry. And philosopher Rustan said something a few years ago, and Professor Lacadena has quoted it. Human beings with new technologies are trying to become God before really learning how to be men and women. This is what SIBI wants to prevent. Human beings need to be human beings, not gods. You remember saying that, Professor Lacadena, right?
cosas, evidentemente.
So, of course, there are absolutely essential mechanisms. We have great skills as human beings. We don't want to become gods. We don't want to build temples or tombs or drop bombs or submarines or see people die in a completely unacceptable way because we lack empathy. Be it in Ukraine, any place in the world can face problems because of flood and lack of infrastructure. But we have two essential values. The first one being reason. We are beings with reason and the possibility to be rational and to think. And SIBI thinks that it has to resonate with safety, equality, and other values. The values that make us think. Because we're only rational or logical if we show this kind of values. Not just because someone said that we have to be rational and reasonable. No, we need to show how rational and reasonable we are. I can say it again, we've been doing this quietly without boasting about it, just because we think this is the way to go. And then we also have our words, the fundamental weapon. That's why the students this morning said that instead of using words for evil purposes or perverted purposes, or instead of using it not for an accurate or precise dialogue, use it for purposeful things, the use of CRISPR in a suitable way. And we need to be able to enter a dialogue, to spread the knowledge. Let us not go back to the situation I lived when I was in Canada in a meeting with the Committee of Ethics of Spain to solve the misunderstandings between economy, biology, bioethics. We have to understand each other. We have to build a future that lies mainly in their hands.
And there are other institutions such as Mar de Niebla that is also performing a great work. For me, I know that I do not have much time left. It is a great satisfaction to see you here. I know that most of you, because throughout these years I have received information, I know that you are going to carry back with you the best message that the committee, the scientific committee of the SIBI and all the group of collaborators belong to a modern civilized society that has all the resources or tries to get all the resources to understand a better world, empathetic and in peace in the future. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Marcelo. Vamos a pasar ahora a la...
We will now move on to the closing talk. We have the great honor to have here with us Dr. Altacharo, Emeritus Professor of Law and Bioethics, University of Wisconsin, Madison. The title of her talk is Realizing the Global Potential of Genome Editing.
Gracias. Thank you all, especially Dr. Palacios, Isolina, Luis, the SIBI committee for the extraordinary honor of being your final speaker, and to the audience for your extraordinary patience for continuing to sit for yet one more talk. I know I stand between you and an opportunity to enjoy the sunshine and the beautiful environment of Asturias. And thank you as well for allowing me to speak in English. Comprendo más que yo hablo. You do not want to hear me speak in Spanish. Yesterday at lunch, I listened to one of our colleagues from Malawi who co-chaired a session this morning talk about a beautiful dream. He talked about all of these advanced technologies as a beautiful dream, and that every living person matters, and so it's a beautiful dream to see anybody cured, but that it's a dream that most people in his country and most people around the world wake up to and find that this dream means nothing to them. I'm here to spend a little time talking about things you've heard before, but maybe with more detail. How we can stop sleeping through the innovation of technology and start working toward making that dream a reality. To do that, though, I must, consistent with the way in which we tend to do things at home, and I'm looking for the way to change my, how do I get to my next slide? Oh, there we go. Will that do it? Can somebody help me here just to show me how to get to the next slide? It's not doing anything. Use that one? Okay, thank you. Ah, there we go. I should tell you, in terms of my areas of conflict and bias, that I do get paid to give advice on both ethics and regulatory policy to some biotechnology companies. Two of them are companies I'm going to mention during this presentation. One is Vertex, and one is CSL, which is an Australian company. I'm also going to be discussing some things I was involved in, including a report from the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine on equitable innovation in health and medicine. I co-chaired the committee that worked on that topic, and I was also a member of the organizing committee for the Third International Summit on Genome Editing, and I will be referencing those things, so I do have a bias when it comes to those topics. We will probably look back at the 2020s, the decade of the 2020s, as the time when traditional gene therapy and now genome editing therapies became a frequent reality. This is almost every day an announcement. This is just from 3 days ago, 4 days ago, I guess now, about an advance in terms of a particular genetic disorder that causes deafness, that starts even before birth. And this child was born with that particular disorder, and her parents talked about how this particular therapy almost immediately gave her the ability to hear them even just whispering, and how it had been their dream that she could hear their voices. So for these people, a dream has come true. And you've already met Victoria Gray, who's now become the face of genome editing as the first person to have been cured of sickle cell anemia through a genome editing therapy. And this is where she was speaking at our summit in London in March of 2023. And she had had a horribly difficult experience as a patient with extraordinary levels of pain that kept her from working, kept her from enjoying life. And it got to the point where she had talked about having doctors stop treating her and allowing herself to die. And she spoke with great emotion at this meeting how she could, as she said, no longer live like this, and how when she finally received this therapy, these super cells, these edited stem cells, that the life that I once felt I was only existing in, I am now thriving in. And she talked about this as a proof that miracles can exist and that God and science can coexist. I get emotional even reading it, because in the audience we were crying as we listened to her talk about the change in her life. But it would be foolish for us to think that this is an easy path, because this particular treatment is not only very expensive, as you've heard and I will talk about, but it is also extremely difficult, because to do it, you have to edit the cells outside the body. So you start with chemotherapy regimes that require multiple hospitalization stays with significant medical risks of their own, and then the removal of cells from the bone marrow, and then the ex vivo treatment of the cells in a laboratory before the cells are returned to the body. She did not live near a hospital where this could be done. She was traveling across multiple states in the southern part of my country in order to get the kind of facilities that were needed to deliver this care and the kind of professional expertise that was needed. So part of the problem with this approach is that it not only is extremely sophisticated technically and expensive to develop from the pharmaceutical point of view, but from the patient point of view, this is an extremely difficult and time-consuming and painful kind of therapy, which, by the way, also leaves the patient infertile, which is an additional complication if you want to treat early in life before sickle cell anemia has taken its toll on the body in pain and disability. This is an article that came out last week about the first patient who's beginning a newly approved sickle cell gene therapy in the U.S., a therapy that could also be used for beta thalassemia from a different company. This is Bluebird. And this article mentions that at this time, the process is so involved and time-consuming that the company, Bluebird, estimates it could only treat about 100 patients a year. And that's for both sickle cell and for beta thalassemia. And the medical centers can only handle a few patients at a time because it requires intensive care. So between the chemotherapy and the replacement of the cells, the need for professionals, the need for facilities, the need for expensive technical equipment, these are therapies that are not sustainable, not in their current fashion. They are exciting developments, but they are not sustainable. And that is in the United States. And that is in places like Northern Europe or in Australia, where you have countries that have as much wealth as any country on the planet. And yet, even in those settings, this is not sustainable, not financially, nor is it sustainable logistically. So why pursue it? Given all of this, why pursue it? The reason is that it has extraordinary possible benefits. That is the dream. This is the dream, to have a therapy in which one-time interventions cure the patient. Instead of taking a pill or going for transfusions every week or every month for your entire life, you go in once and you are cured. One and done is the phrase we use in English, one and done. And we're seeing progress in areas of gene therapy and genome editing for these so-called one-and-done approaches. And I've listed here just a few, one for hemophilia B, which is showing tremendous progress, so you don't need regular infusions for clotting factor for hemophilia. Another one, Roctavian, which is a single dose, showing effectiveness over 7 years. Zolgensma is for spinal muscular atrophy, also extremely useful, although not a cure. And if you want, if we had time, we would talk about potentially moving the treatment from childhood all the way back to the fetus while still in development in the womb, in the uterus, which is now being done in San Francisco. Abecma and Kymriah, these are other kinds of examples. If you can cure somebody a single time with a single intervention, you have improved their life tremendously. And you have had all these other benefits for society. They can become productive citizens, productive members of families. It has benefits for everybody in the community as well as for the patient. That's why we are still pursuing this dream despite the obvious obstacles. And so right now, there's an ever-growing list of already approved gene therapies and genome editing therapies. Casgevy, which is the one, as I told you, I've got the conflict on because I worked with Vertex, that company. Casgevy for sickle cell, but then these others for in the areas of traditional gene therapies, all getting approvals. We're now up to, I believe, about 115 approvals in the United States. I don't know the number, the equivalent number here in Europe, and it is just speeding up. But there are some limitations. For example, in the area of traditional gene therapies, for things like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which will cause progressive muscle weakness and often a very early death for the boys who inherit this disorder, the gene therapy relies upon a viral vector, usually the adenovirus viral vector, for the delivery of the healthy gene. And the trouble then is that that creates a kind of an immune system response to that virus. And if you need to have a second dose, if it's not one and done, but if you need a second dose, you can't do it because the body now will have a reaction against that vector. So we've learned with Duchenne's that although you have long-term effectiveness, it's not quite one and done. Another problem, we tend to have approvals that are based on what we would call surrogate endpoints or substitute endpoints. Instead of waiting to see the clinical outcome, we look for markers like the lowering of a level of something in the blood or some temporary increase in muscle strength. And we say, okay, that suggests this really will work in the long term. We don't want to make all these other patients wait because they'll get sicker while they wait. So we will approve this therapy, give it to these other people, and hope that we're right. And we keep checking. Did this initial marker, this initial signal of success, was it confirmed with clinical outcomes years later, right? But sometimes they're not confirmed. And sometimes companies don't follow up with the trials and studies you need to make those confirmations. So that is a challenge. Long-term follow-up. We're working in an area where we need to understand the long-term consequences of gene replacements and gene editing, and it may not be the case that we see those consequences immediately. So we need to have follow-up. Now that's true for every drug, but for traditional drugs that clear the body quickly as they're metabolized, follow-up may be a day or a month. Here we're talking about follow-up for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, to make sure that we understand how this replacement gene or edited gene is functioning in a person's body. In the course of that, companies go away. They go bankrupt or they're swallowed up by another company, or the doctor that's treating the patient has retired and it's a new doctor. We have enormous challenges of continuity, and we really don't yet have a system in place for anticipating the financial and practical needs for follow-up that goes for 10 and 20 and 30 years. And yet, at least the Food and Drug Administration in my country, where I worked for a while, has recommended at least 15 years for follow-up for most of these therapies. And then, as I mentioned in passing, there are some disorders that really need to be treated even before birth. There are some advantages to treating before birth. Especially if you're using things like viral vectors, you need much lower doses because the fetus is simply smaller. And there are sometimes tissues in the body that are easier to access because they can be accessed through the amniotic fluid. Or it could be that it's a multi-system disorder. Cystic fibrosis is a multi-system disorder. We think of it as being about the lungs, but it's also about the digestive system. It's about the reproductive system because it affects the mucous lining of many tissues. So after birth, it can be hard to deliver the corrective genes into each system that's affected. Do it while the child is in utero, and you might be able to get a wider biodistribution and be able to actually treat more effectively. But that means you have to do these things while somebody is still pregnant, where the woman's body is in between you and the fetus you want to treat. This adds a whole new level of complication, especially if you're in a country with complicated politics and laws surrounding pregnancy management and abortion, increasingly a problem in my own country. So there are significant limitations on these gene therapies despite the one-and-done promise of them. Some of these issues are being tackled with technical advances, and Luis opened our meeting 2 days ago talking about the advances in prime editing and base editing, some of which will help with our concerns, for example, about off-target effects and such. But there are many other obstacles we need to deal with. If we want to get to the point at which this dream becomes something closer to reality, we need a more holistic approach. Our organizer statement from the 3rd International Genome Editing Summit, I see that one of our fellow members of the Summit Organizing Committee, Françoise Bayless, is still here in the audience and was responsible for some of this language, talked about the need for a commitment to equitable and financially sustainable and accessible means to promote genome editing. And to get there, among other things, the research has to include more genetically diverse populations so that we understand the human variations that may account for the side effects or the lack of effectiveness in some cases that may actually correlate with genetic variations that are seen among different populations. That the cost and structure, in fact, the whole business model by which genome editing in pharmaceuticals are developed has to be changed, or we will never get past some of the pricing problems that I'll talk about in a moment. That we have technical possibilities, moving away from that very expensive and cumbersome and complicated ex vivo system that we used for Victoria Gray toward an in vivo system in which you simply inject something into the human body and have that be the way in which you introduce the new genetic material. And then a general strengthening of the healthcare systems themselves in order to sustain this kind of advance. And you already saw a reference to this report. I believe it was my colleague Eva Bartnick who actually showed exactly this picture. The Innovative Genomics Institute is a joint venture of the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, San Francisco. And they put out what is still today the most sophisticated analysis of the business challenges to getting the price for genome editing therapies down to something that is beginning to approach, not arriving, but beginning to approach affordable. To do that, it helps to take a look at the kind of universe of entities that are involved in that pharmaceutical ecosystem. And I can't spend too much time or I'll run over time. But you have the funders and sponsors at the earliest stages who are really in it for public benefit. And their goal is really to develop things that will be exciting and have possibilities. But even they, in their effort to maximize social value, are going to be faced with extremely difficult financial challenges. For one thing, most of these kinds of academic centers that do the basic research don't have the kind of facilities you need to manufacture things up to the standard necessary when you're going to move from research in the laboratory to research with human beings. So-called good manufacturing practices require a certain standard, and those laboratories are very expensive. So they tend to outsource, and when they outsource, they have to pay others to do it at a very, very high price. Then you have this middle section of the clinical trials that are run under the authority of the regulatory agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the EMA here in Europe. And in that area, you run into extremely high costs because the cost of running clinical trials has gotten greater and greater over time. Now, to some extent, that's because we decided to do them ethically, and that is a cost that is highly justified. But sometimes it's because those trials have now become multinational. Many of the disorders we're looking at are rather rare diseases because they're starting with things that have a single gene or a very limited number of genes that cause the illness. The illnesses are fairly rare. That means you need to find patients in multiple countries with different rules and different standards for how to run a clinical trial means that the bureaucracy that you run into and the regulatory standards for approval that you run into will vary from place to place, and that adds a lot of cost. You're also dealing with a lot of intellectual property at this point. You need tools, you need drugs, you need a whole variety of individual elements, each one subject to intellectual property that can be very costly when it comes to the licensing agreements or the material transfer agreements. And then finally, when you get close to the point of moving into approval and marketing, you're now in the for-profit sector, and that sector, naturally enough, is going to be trying to get back the costs of its own investments, which can be quite substantial at this point, and are going to be charging whatever they can, given the particular jurisdiction that they occupy. So these are the stakeholders that one has to think about when you're trying to figure out where can I make a change that is going to result in a lower price at the end of this process to make it more affordable ultimately for the patient. And every one of these entities along here may have a role to play. One thing one can do is simply start by asking, can we find an alternative pricing model, something better than whatever I can get when I try to sell the product? And one is a simple cost-plus model, an agreement that whatever it costs, we will allow a profit of a certain percent. That is something that has been tried in a couple of cases with certain drugs. And if you have a very large population that needs your therapy, and that might be the case if it were something like sickle cell or something like cystic fibrosis, then the excess revenues could actually help to subsidize the cost of the rare diseases where there's no way that even at, let's say, a 10% profit on your investment could ever be attractive because the number of patients is simply not that large. Another version of a pricing system that might help is something called outcome-based pricing, in which you actually say, we will only pay if you get certain results. And that actually sounds very sensible, and in some ways it has the most intuitive attractiveness because it links the value of the cure to the value that the company will get in terms of its profits back for having developed the cure. So in a way, it's a way to share the risk. And it now shares the risk between the manufacturers and the insurance company that is paying for the therapy. It is, however, logistically challenging because it means you have to track every patient and find out how they're doing every year for 20 years in order to figure out how much money that particular level of health improvement is worth. That is not an easy thing to do. There is a pilot project going on now in the United States to try to see if this can be managed. And who knows, maybe with the advances in computerization that we've been seeing over the last 20 years, it will become possible. Certainly countries that have national health care systems have an easier time to manage the just record-keeping and data analysis necessary to do something like this. So the experience elsewhere outside the U.S. may be quite different. But outcome-based pricing is a nice way to link intrinsic value with profit. Then there is another model that the people at the Innovative Genomics Institute came up with called the 10 times less model. What they did is, after a lot of research, they got an idea about how much money companies tend to be investing in the development process, including the development of things that don't turn out to work, because there's a tremendous amount of failure along the way before you get to a therapy that works. And basically, we're talking often $1 billion. And I know that, Ava, you talked about how sometimes it's not as expensive as it seems, but when one looks broadly across all of the costs and not just the cost of the first technological development, it can be quite substantial. And then they calculated what is the opportunity cost. If that $1 billion hadn't been spent on this drug, it could have been spent someplace else. What would investors demand as a return? And based on that, they said, let's say we give you 7 years to make back a return that will satisfy investors. And even better, let's have a new model of a non-profit instead of a for-profit company, so the investors will take a lower return. And let's figure out what the other costs are, and now we're going to divide that by the number of patients per year, and that will give us a price. Now, I want you to notice that at this time, the prices that we're looking at here, the numbers that we're looking at here, are still way, way out of reach for most of the planet. So if you have a price per patient of something like $244,000, right, which would account for the reasonable return on $1 billion investment over 7 to 10 years. That is already 1,000 times less than the cost of many of these drugs now. If they're coming out now at $2.5 million and $3 million per patient, and you've driven the price down to $250,000, you've dropped the price by a factor of 1,000. And yet, you'd have to drop it by another factor of 1,000 to get it to the point where it's affordable for everybody on the planet. So it gives us some idea about the scale of the challenge ahead of us. But I'd say dropping the price by 1,000%, 1,000 times cheaper, that's progress, right? It's not getting us there yet, but at least it's beginning to show us some pathways and some ideas about how to do it. So the real challenge is we need to get insurers away from the idea that there has to be a multi-million-dollar price tag that covers a single upfront payment. We might be talking about a payment that's made over time, the way people buy houses. It could be a subscription structure in which insurance companies basically insure themselves against the possibility that one person in their insurance pool might need this therapy. And so they subscribe for a fee to have access to these expensive therapies, and if one comes along that's needed, they get it. And if they turn out not to need it, they've still paid the subscription price. There are some very innovative ideas floating out there to try and basically spread the cost across time, across people, across companies, and across time. So that's the first level of effort to try and drive the price down and make this more accessible. The second is to have more competition in the market. So this came out just about 3 weeks ago. This is from Pfizer is now coming out with Becvest, which is on par with Hemgenix. Hemgenix is a therapy from CSL. That's another company I mentioned I do have a relationship with. And these are companies that are using some of these alternative strategies to try and make the prices more attractive. CSL uses value-based agreements, so that's the outcome-based notion. Pfizer is a warranty that if the therapy is working, then the insurer gets, then the insurer pays. If it's not working, then the insurer doesn't. But pricing is only part of what makes things accessible. So let's look beyond pricing therapies. One is, how do we speed the development in a way that makes it easier, faster, and cheaper? One thing is we need a lot more automation so that we're not doing everything in a customized fashion. So we need standardized platform technologies. And again, I believe that Luis actually showed a slide showing this exact thing where you have a platform and then all you're doing is changing the target, changing the target, changing the target. It allows both manufacturing to be sped up, and it also allows regulatory agencies to have more confidence at quickly reviewing because they already have seen that platform before. They know how it functions. Operating procedures that are standardized and simplifying the whole area of patents and licenses and material transfer agreements so that that moves more smoothly. And finally, to have non-viral methods for gene modification, because the viral delivery vectors are a big part of the cost in terms of both manufacturing and quality control. They're a really major obstacle. And so shorter lead times and easier manufacturing with alternative ways to deliver. These manufacturing challenges will go away over time as we become more familiar with the field, but we still have to put in the money now for the building of the facilities. The facilities have to be GMP, good manufacturing practices. and they have to have very high quality assurance systems in order to comply with regulatory standards. And we need to build them all around the planet. We learned this during COVID, that if you didn't have the facilities locally, you often were unable to obtain the vaccines. This is going to be true in other areas too. Having localized manufacturing, decentralized manufacturing will help a lot. Regulation. And I've already alluded to this. I'm hoping somebody can help me with the time here, how much time I have left. This is just, and I don't need you to go through the entire slide, but this is just to give you some idea of the duration that these clinical trials involve, or the whole regulatory process can involve. And you're often looking at something on the order of 7 to 10 years. That is a long period of time. And if you think about the money that's gone into it, that the investors are sitting on, the investors are waiting for a return on their money, that time period is a challenge. It's also a challenge for patients who are waiting to get therapies that might turn out to work. And so beginning to figure out ways to standardize certain aspects of this whole development process can also help to lower costs and increase accessibility in the end. One thing that is probably going to make a difference is the move, to some extent, away from live animal testing and toward the use of organoids and assembloids as an alternative to animal testing, coupled with artificial intelligence, as we get more and more data for the artificial intelligence to work with. And that may turn out to be a major advance in this area, as well as an advance in animal welfare if we no longer need to use them for testing. Last week was the American Society for Cell and Gene Therapy meeting. It was taking place in Baltimore, back home where I am. And Peter Marks, who is the head of the Center for Biologics at the Food and Drug Administration, talked about what an exciting time it is, about how they've got 19 approved products already, but he cited specifically some of these challenges in manufacturing, in clinical development timelines, and in the diverse global regulatory requirements. He called it a critical juncture. And he talked about the fact that there are products that would probably work, and they are dropping out of development because it takes so long to get them through this process that the investors are not willing to wait for a return on their investment. And so the products are not commercially viable. That, to me, seems terrible, that we have not solved the business problem or the regulatory problem, and we're losing out on potential cures. One step that he identified as almost but not quite ready is for the regulatory agencies, the major regulatory agencies, the EMA, the FDA, the Australian, Japanese, Brazilian, etc., to be coordinating with through the International Conference on Harmonization on some of the technical standards for the preclinical and clinical testing as a way to try and speed up the development and ease this pathway. But beyond that, we also can be looking at possibilities that will just make the entire process easier. Remember going back to that experience that Victoria Gray had and the boy who had the bluebird therapy had. This whole process of the chemotherapy, the bone marrow ablation, the bone marrow retrieval, treating the stem cells, putting them back is just terrible. And so what we are all waiting for is in vivo editing, right? Editing in which you simply insert something into the body and it travels to the organ of interest, edits the cells, edits the genes, and then begins the process of either ameliorating or curing the disease. And I know that Eva said she's a science fiction fan, so am I. I used to watch Star Trek quite religiously. And of course, on Star Trek, you'll remember that the way they treated people, they would always just press something in their arms, and you hear a little noise go, shh, and something would go into the arm, and suddenly they'd be cured, right? It was magic, right? So that is the future that everybody is thinking about, and it's a future that they were dreaming about back in the 1960s with the initial version of Star Trek. Well, Well, that's what this would look like. As compared to ex vivo, which is on the right-hand side of this chart, with the removal of cells, the correction of cells, and then the transplantation, in vivo is simply the injection of either a viral or a non-viral vector, and it has to get to the target, but it certainly already looks simpler. So here are two companies that are already working on this, Intellia and Regeneron, and they are using a Cas9 via simply an IV. Right, so first the patient gets steroids and antihistamines to guard against an immune reaction, goes into a clinic, gets an IV. Many people have had an IV, so hey, that's not so bad. The IV runs in and the patient goes home. The delivery is not a viral vector. Here they're working with lipid nanoparticles, another thing that Luis had already introduced to us in his first talk. Lipid nanoparticles, like a fat globule, right? And it's metabolized when it reaches the target cell. So the companies are looking at diseases that are expressed in the cells of the liver, because those cells will naturally attract these lipid nanoparticles. And this is easier. Thank you. Oh, I appreciate that. It was a time check she was giving me. Where was I? So the cells of the liver will attract the liver nanoparticles, and there's an advantage here over those viral vectors, because from a manufacturing point of view, these lipid nanoparticles can drive down the manufacturing complexity considerably. So right now, these companies are in phase 3 trials. That means that they've actually shown some effectiveness already in smaller populations, and they've moved out to larger populations for a particular genetic condition that expresses in a liver protein and winds up leading to problems in the heart or in the nervous system. And so far, they are seeing dramatic results that have lasted at least a year. So this is a major advance. We've got, first of all, an in vivo system, so you don't have chemotherapy and months in the hospital, and you've got a delivery vector with the lipid nanoparticle that's easier to manufacture and less expensive, and we have a very strong response. So this is progress on a technical level, which could be coupled then with progress on regulatory pathways and could be coupled with pricing models and insurance models. And we're beginning to build, brick by brick, right, a structure that could support a much less expensive, much less time-consuming, much more accessible way to deliver gene editing and gene therapies generally. So for the first time now, we're looking at this kind of editing in vivo system for blindness, and we've got children that are actually able to see again. I mean, these are things that people have imagined for generations, and suddenly it's possible for a few children, still in trials, but it's a first step, right? It's just the first step. I want to, though, close in my last few minutes talking more generally about how to incorporate concepts of equity into the innovation process. Because so far I've been talking about gene therapy and gene editing in particular, but this is a problem that is present in all areas of innovative and emerging therapies and emerging science. How do we start thinking from the very beginning about ways to make things more equitable? Let me give you a very concrete example. During the pandemic, it was important to understand what the oxygen level was in a patient in order to see exactly how much the disease was, how much damage it was doing to them. So it was very common that people would use a pulse oximeter. You stick it on a finger, and it would tell you what your oxygen saturation levels were. The pulse oximeter has been around for decades. I mean, I think it was developed in the 60s or 70s, at least a half a century. It turned out that the readings were not very accurate for people who had darker skin, because it read through the skin and it used light to perceive the blood, and so the tone of the skin mattered in how accurately it would see. And the reason the accuracy was off is because it had never been tested originally on a variety of skin tones. So because people weren't thinking from the very beginning about the full population that needs to use this device, it turned out to be giving inaccurate readings for a very substantial part of the population. And it took a while for anybody to figure it out. So one of the things that is required if we're going to get to truly equitable innovation is to have the imagination about the range of people who may be involved in dreaming up the idea of a new therapy or thinking about what's important to develop a therapy for. What are the diseases we care about or the conditions we care about? How do those people live? What do they look like? What do they eat like? What other diseases do they have? To have the imagination that builds this more comprehensive vision of the world of people who are affected before you actually start down the road can make sure that you don't create drugs or devices that don't work for everybody. So the committee that I worked on talked about this, and we came up with a variety of observations. So here's a piece from the journal Vox talking about how, to this day, most of the reference genomes, again, Luis basically gave the entire conference talk on the first day. If you were here, you didn't need to come to the rest. He talked about the fact that we don't have a representative set of data to represent the full population on the planet and all of the genetic variations that are typical. And that is a problem because it can be that some things will work better than others when they're in the presence of certain genetic variants. So the first thing that is a real obstacle in the way of progress on anything having to do with genetics and medicine is having full information about the genetics of the world population. This seems obvious, but apparently it was not obvious, or at least it was not considered important enough to be a priority from the very beginning. If we want to step back a second and take a look at all of the possibilities, we can think about this in terms of an innovation life cycle, where you start by conceiving of an idea, and then you begin to research and develop it, you evaluate it, and then you learn from that, and then you improve it. And so what do we need to do? We need to broaden the range of people who are involved in that first step of conceiving and embarking on an idea, so that that greater imagination about what might be important to do and how to do it starts at the beginning. We then need to have, and I'll talk about these in my last few minutes, some very specific incentives so that the people who are investing money, the people who are doing the research, the people who are developing the drugs, all have a reason to be thinking about this when they go through their little steps of this process. And then you need to have a system of learning, where you observe, how is this working in the population? Are there people that can't use this, not just because it's expensive, but because it's simply not appropriate for them, and then begin to improve and change. So we need to think about this as a cycle in which there's constant improvement. I will not go through the details, but these slides are taken from our report in which we looked at each of the stakeholders, each of the players in these stages, looked at what they could be doing and how that might affect the outcome. So for funders, we talked about the idea that funders should require that the person asking for money has to anticipate, how is this going to represent the full population? How will it lead to being widely usable? And to put that into the grant application and make that one factor in whether or not funding is given, so that funders can have a tremendous opportunity, and they can be public funders or private funders, philanthropic funders or government funders. That the research organizations can develop guidance and professional training so that people have learned how to project into the future, how their research might have some effect, right? And to learn how to partner with potentially affected communities who may be able to give them some ideas. Well, that might not work because in our community, nobody would trust that kind of professional. Or in our community, people eat a certain food and you should know that that drug is going to become ineffective in the presence of that food. We already know some drugs don't work with certain foods, and if you don't live in that community, you don't eat that diet, you don't know these things. And so the research universities need to be thinking about how to train people in this kind of thing. The Patent and Trademark Office has the opportunity to place requirements on patent holders, that they license in a way that is more consistent with public need and public value. For one thing, they can insist on competitive licensing. Non-exclusive licensing immediately creates a competitive environment that tends to drive down prices. But it's also about making things simpler, making material transfer agreements standardized and simpler, and the Patent Office can help with this kind of thing. Having the regulatory agencies work toward harmonizing regulations. Right now, we often have minor differences between the regulatory agencies that really are not important enough to justify the kind of way in which they slow down the research process. We want to make every bureaucratic step something that makes sense, something that adds value in terms of protecting the human subjects of research or in ensuring that we have an effective and safe medicine at the end of the day. And then finally, for the healthcare payers and the delivery systems, trying to look at both the pricing systems, the insurance coverage decisions, and how they try to align their portfolios in terms of making sure that they are covering what's needed for the widest possible population. There's no way you can make any sense of this chart, but I'm going to tell you what it is because it was an effort that we had to create a way for all of these stakeholders to test whether or not they're making progress. So on the left-hand side, what you cannot see are the principles that we had identified, and they'll sound very familiar. Justice, autonomy, fairness, collective good, as well as individual good. And across the top are all the different entities I've been mentioning: academia, healthcare providers, investors, governments, nonprofits. And the idea was for each one to be able to basically give themselves a grade. Am I doing very well? Am I doing very poorly in trying to incorporate consideration of justice in how I structure my grant-making process? Is my work on this particular drug from the private sector something that's doing well or badly in terms of collective good for society? It's just a way for every one of these entities to measure their own progress toward incorporating equity into their innovation process. We thought that these principles are a good way to think about both how policy is made, who is at the table, who's coming up with the ideas, who is funding them, who's deciding which ones to pursue, as well as what policy is being made. What is a reasonable risk and a benefit? What is sufficiently sustainable? What is sufficiently protective of individual preferences? What is sufficiently protective of collective good? We thought that these principles, which all seem very familiar, are the kinds of principles that should be used for both these things: how policy is made, what policy is made. That, by the way, is an insight that came from the WHO committee that worked on genome editing policy that Eva and Francoise had served on, along with Hervé Schneiweiss. So I want to end here by simply saying that genome editing right now is just a dream. It's a dream on the verge of becoming reality. My concern is that, as my colleague from Malawi was saying at lunch yesterday, it's a dream that will not allow most people on the planet to wake up and find that there's something there for them. Right now, they're waking up to find that they can't even get the old-fashioned therapies, let alone think about the new therapies. So my dream, my hope, is that these steps and others that people smarter than me can think of will help us a little bit by little bit move toward making these things truly a reality for everybody. Not because we should be focusing on this to the exclusion of those things that work today, but because 100 years from now, this will be, I hope, the way we all get to live. One and done, cured, and able to enjoy our lives. That's my dream for us, and I wish you all a very good trip home. Thank you for your patience.
Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Alta Charo. Aunque en la conferencia de clausura no hay intervenciones, voy a darle de forma excepcional a permitirle al profesor Lluís Montoliu por las alusiones que le hizo la doctora Alta Charo. Muy breve.
So thank you, Alta, for enlightening us and illustrating all your wisdom on this topic. Earlier today, Devlin from Malawi shared his dream about eventually one day getting this innovation and technologies reaching out Africa. I wanted to ask you, we showed the world that when the pandemic was hitting us, nobody had budgeted for the production of vaccines, but nonetheless, governments and companies invested billions of dollars, and we eventually managed to get vaccines to everyone freely distributed. European Commission was purchasing vaccines for everyone in Europe, and etc. So my question, which let me dream, let me share my dream to you and ask you, would it be possible to do the same for a number of these very severe diseases and convince government and companies that this is worth the effort?
So you're absolutely right that the pandemic proved that you can have a public and private partnership that can drive the price down and can make things available more widely. But that said, let us all take a moment to recognize that it was a very imperfect system, right? And that despite the global decision to have a rational distribution of vaccine from the very beginning, in fact, individual countries, my own included, cut deals with individual companies to make sure that first they got what they needed for their own citizens, and then they would distribute to the rest of the world. That's why I was saying how important it is to have your own manufacturing facility. So even in the face of a global catastrophe, we were unable to overcome domestic politics. I worked in politics off and on in my career. I've been in and out of government and academia. So I'm a cynic. And so I don't think it's very easy to get past domestic politics. I think that the pandemic was almost a unique situation. I don't have confidence that this set of therapies is yet at the point in which you would have that kind of global enthusiasm to do something, specifically because these diseases, they're not contagious. So if you have this problem in Spain, it doesn't make me feel threatened in the United States. During the pandemic, it did. Right? And during the pandemic, we watched as it went from country to country. It started in, we saw in Italy, everybody applauding all the people. Remember, they were applauding and making music for the nurses and doctors. But we all knew that the next thing was it was going to jump. Here, without that kind of fear, I'm not sure we would get to that level of willingness on the part of governments to collaborate, and certainly not on the part of companies to give up some of their profit potential. So that's not a great way to end the conference, because that's a very depressing way to end. But I think it's realistic.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Y tengo el placer.
And I have the pleasure, before officially closing the 12th World Conference on Bioethics, I invite you to the 13th World Conference on Bioethics that will be held here in the city of GIJON in 2026. And the topic is decided unanimously by the scientific committee: bioethics, justice and social inclusion determinants. You're all invited to attend that conference, and I'm going to ask you to come up here to the panel because we are going to take a family picture. Thank you very much.